I'd like to cover some of the libraries that we use for the backend. The main framework that we leverage is called Flask, and we in particular use the RESTful flavor of it to give us a lot of free features while building the REST API calls. We also use Marshmallow to define our request and response schemas, and Swagger is a really awesome library that allows us to display this nicely in a UI so that users don't need to go dig in our code, users meaning developers, to figure out what endpoints are available. We also use Argon for password hashing and JSON Web Tokens to handle our authentication and authorization workflow, which is what our two newest volunteers, Shaili and Yujing, will be talking about. And finally, we do use Mininet, which allows us to emulate the networks like you saw in the console tab. That's going to be our last backend talk of the day. So here is our diagram again. What Yujing and Shaili are going to be talking about is this connection between the front end and the back end. How do we allow people, or how do we allow Tay to access her data, but make sure that Scott can't access it? So with that, I pass it to Shaili.
Hi, everybody. I'm Shaili. I'm a third year at the University of Chicago as a computer science major. And today I want to talk to you about JSON Web Tokens, which are a technology you can use in your authentication and authorization processes. So first, let's talk about what the actual difference between authentication and authorization is. So authentication confirms the identity of a user, make sure they are who they say they are via password or one-time PIN, whereas authorization ensures that once the user is who they say they are, we make sure they're only accessing what they're supposed to be able to access. So although they seem like they are simultaneous processes, they're actually two different steps. You have to be verified before you can be authorized to access other things. For example, if you take two people, Alice and Bob, Alice is an administrator. They both have to go through the authentication process to be sure that Alice is actually Alice and Bob is actually Bob. But once we know that they are who they are, we have to make sure that Alice is able to access the parts of the resource that an administrator is supposed to access, and Bob can only access the generic user features. And so at Project Reclass, we use JSON Web Tokens, or JOTs, because they're a compact and self-contained way of transmitting information via a JSON object. And they can be verified since they're digitally signed using a secret or using a private-public key pair. So there are three parts to a JSON Web Token. There's the header, which contains the algorithm type and the signing algorithm. There's the payload, which contains the actual data that's being transmitted between parties, and they're both base64 URL encoded for security purposes. And then the signature is actually calculated based off of the header and the payload. So if either the header or the payload are tampered with, it's very easy to determine whether that has occurred because the signature will be completely different. Next slide, please. So once a user has been authenticated, they're given a JSON Web Token, or a JOT, and at that point, every time they make a request to access something, the JOT is sent, and it is scanned to make sure that the user actually has these credentials in order to access what they're requesting access to. And so let's talk about the benefits of JOTs compared to especially the security assertion markup language tokens, or SAML tokens. So firstly, JOTs are much more compact because JSON objects are much smaller compared to XML. It's much less verbose, excuse me. And so since they're smaller when encoded, they're more compact when they're passed into HTTP and HTML environments. And this small improvement has a lot of performance benefits on the internet scale, especially in mobile platforms that have resource constraints. Another benefit is that JSON parsers in general are more common because they map directly to objects, and that makes JOTs a lot more simple to work with compared to SAML tokens. So when I got JOT working on my own project, I was really, really excited because aside from the groundwork laid before I joined, including JOT in my project really only took 2 lines of code. So if you're interested in using JOT for one of your projects, Yujing will now show you how to get that started. Thanks.
Thanks, Shaili. Hello, everybody. My name is Yujing, and I'm a data analyst trying to transition to software engineering. I was very excited to have the chance to get hands-on experience in Toynet and started to work on small tickets related to the Flask framework, where I learned about how JOT works, and I would like to share that with you. I'm going to walk through some sample code of how JOT is used in Toynet for authorization. Flask JOT Extended is a very popular library that supports JOT to Flask. The main functions Toynet uses from this library are create access token, JOT required, and get JOT identity. I will briefly show how these functions are applied to the backend code in a bit. Another tool we use is Postman, which is a graphical interface for interacting with the API. It can be used to create, update, or delete an object in an user interface. And we can use it to see how JOT works in the front end. The first screenshot, the first screenshot on the right is the code sample that uses the create access token function to actually generate JOT. The second screenshot is the corresponding window of Postman to show how the backend code we just saw works. So here we can use the body tab to provide the credentials, which is a JSON key value set. And after we hit send to send our credentials to the API, it will return a token. And this is the token we can use to make any changes to the places that require a token. And next slide, please. And this is the part we set up where we want the interaction to be protected. For example, when we want to protect the database by requesting a token, when the user wants to make any changes to it, we can simply add the JOT required function as a decorator, as you can see in the screenshot on the left, so that when the user wants to update the database defined by this class, the token is needed to attach to their calls. We can also use the get JOT identity function to access the identity of the current user. And in the screenshot on the right is the Postman UI again, where we are trying to create an object to add to the table called value. And because of the JOT required decorator we added in the class that defined this database earlier, a token is required when we try to make an update. And in Postman, we can attach the JOT with the bearer token type in the auth tab when creating new values in the existing database. And after we hit send, the database will be updated. And that is a simple example of how JOT can be used in the project. Now I will pass it to Arthur, who's going to show you how he was able to implement backend functionality to support a console tab, and which is the next Toynet emulator feature Tate discussed earlier.
Thanks, Yujing. So I'm Arthur Lacey. I'm a backend engineer here with Project Reclass, and I'm very passionate about the opportunities that education opens up for people. So for this project, we were focused on the interfaces between our Flask backend and our Mininet containers and making sure that we would be able to communicate with those containers.